If someone were to come up to me and say, "You're the reason I'm an atheist," that's quite a big thing, you know, like your worldview. I've always said to people in this discussion that I would love to believe in God. I'd love to be a Christian. You know, I wish it were true. It would be awesome. And so if that's the case, then I'm not going to like celebrate someone becoming an atheist. Like whatever, you know, do your thing, believe it or don't believe. Like I'm not trying to make the world into atheists. I'm not sure if that would be a good or a bad thing. I have no idea. I just don't think it's true. I'm interested in the truth question.
Have you never set out to be, in that sense, an evangelist for atheism then? Hello and welcome to another edition of Re-Enchanting. I'm Justin Brierley.
And I'm Belle Tindall.
And this is the show where we seek to re-enchant an arguably disillusioned, materialistic world with the question of whether it could be re-enchanted with the Christian view of reality. We do it here at the top of Lambeth Palace Library as well, which is a wonderful place to try and re-enchant our guests, isn't it?
Definitely. And today we're re-enchanting Alex O'Connor.
Trying to,
yeah.
It's a sorry trick, bringing me somewhere so beautiful to talk about God.
You see right through us.
We bring you to a beautiful location to make you experience the joy and beauty of life.
It's beautiful. We're looking out onto beauty.
We are.
The building itself is quite new and quite utilitarian.
Yes,
they say that when they first built the Eiffel Tower in Paris, it was quite controversial because it's just this big sort of metal block, and a lot of people were very upset. And one of the leading he was like an artist or a poet or something, might be apocryphal, but they say that once it was finally built, he spent the entire time it's being planned campaigning against it. And as soon as it was built, he would have lunch every single day in the Eiffel Tower because it was the only place in Paris where you couldn't see the
Eiffel Tower.
Nice. That's very good, very good. Well, we love Lambeth Palace Library.
We love Lambeth Palace Library.
Even if it's utilitarian. It's got an amazing view.
And it's in the back garden of a much prettier building, which is just Lambeth Palace.
That's true too. You can't see it from here, can you, the palace itself?
No, not unless you sort of lean over.
Palaces everywhere.
Palaces everywhere.
But we do always ask the same question of our guests to start with, because we're on top of Lambeth Palace Library, which is, what are you reading at the moment?
Yeah, well, that depends when this episode is going out.
Okay.
Because
well, just what you're literally reading right now.
Well, I tend to be mostly consumed in whatever podcast guests I have coming on that week. I have a podcast, Within Reason, which can be found on Spotify and all streaming platforms and YouTube as well.
Oh, you can tell this guy has done this before.
And so I'll be reading the book of the guest that I've got coming on. And so the reason I say it depends when this is coming out is because, you know, I don't like to give away all of the
I see.
all of the guests.
Why don't you give us two truths and a lie?
Keep us guessing.
Okay. Two truths and a lie. Who am I reading? I've been reading Rory Stewart, Sam Harris, and Jimmy Carr.
Nice.
Okay. Well, we know at least two of those guests.
Yeah.
Are going to be
You've got to keep an eye on the channel to see if you guessed right.
There you go.
That.
How about that? Anyway.
How about that?
I thought you might have been reading the Pope's latest book, and that would have. You know...
No. Outside of podcast guests, it's a shame. I feel like I'm back at university where I spend so much time sort of reading essentially for a deadline that. I sort of feel, it's never true, but I feel like I don't have time to read anything else. But what I'd really like to get into at the moment is the history of art. It's one of my one of the areas that I'm really lacking in. And I think Gombrich's Story of Art, this great sort of textbook of art history, I think the best-selling book on art in the world, is probably, I sort of dug into the introduction.
Why is art particularly become something you're interested in lately?
Because I've begun to appreciate it more, I think. I never used to really enjoy art. I never really understood it. I've spoken about this a few times in the context of music, where I think one of the failures that I had in my appreciation of these things is a failure to contextualize. We can walk from here to the National Gallery and we can look around at these really boring oil paintings and just sort of people's faces, and you don't even know who these people are. But when you remember that these are not painted to go into a gallery, they're painted to go on the wall of a church. They're painted for the private collection of a family to commemorate a very specific event. And maybe you're looking at like the Arnolfini portrait and it's just like a man and a woman and they just stood there and it's really boring and quite small. But it's only when you realize that this is one of the oldest oil paintings in the world. This is like the first time this has been seen, and no one knows exactly why it was painting, and the details that are present if you read a bloody book about it, which I've been trying to do. You realize that there's so much more to enjoy, and a lot of people criticize that. They say, "Oh, well, you shouldn't have to sort of read about a painting to enjoy a painting," and I totally understand that. I'm not saying that that's what you should do or how it should be. It just is the case that for me, it sort of opened up this new world of appreciation for what these bits of art are, and so I want to read more.
Very good.
Yeah, I think I would be the same. I can't really look at a piece of art and just soak it up like I'm supposed to, and it is a failing. So now you've given me a tip. I'll see it more as a window than a mirror.
Well, context is always key here. I spoke about this on another show once about Beethoven's Fifth.
Yeah.
Like this really boring piece of. Well, it's not a boring piece of music, but it's boring to us now.
You hear it so much,
exactly.
It becomes kind of, you think you know it. Yeah.
That's right. But you have to imagine that you're living in a time when you never hear music, ever. You don't hear it in the car. You don't hear it in a shop. You don't hear it in a car passing by. The only time you ever hear music, ever, is if you play it yourself, or if you go down to the box office, you buy a ticket, you come back home, you put on your suit and your top hat, you walk down to the concert hall, you shuffle in, you find your seat, you sit down, you wait around, you twiddle your thumbs, then the lights go down, and then da 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 da. And it's like, this is the most amazing thing that I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah.
And listening to it with those ears has like totally opened it up for me. John Berger, is it Berger or Berger? I never know how to say it. Shows how much I know about art history, writes in Ways of Seeing, another great sort of famous commentary on art about, well, he shows this picture by Van Gogh. Well, he doesn't say it's by Van Gogh. He says, look at this painting. Just take a look at it and think about it for a moment. And it's just a picture of some birds. And it's, it's quite a nice painting, whatever. And then you turn the page and he shows you the same painting, but this time it's labeled, this is the last painting Van Gogh ever painted before he killed himself.
Wow.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And suddenly you're looking at it with new eyes.
Yeah.
And, whether you should or shouldn't do that is besides the point. But the point is made that you can change potentially even how beautiful a piece of art is without actually touching the art at all, just by changing sort of the place that you put it in.
Yeah, totally. Whenever we've mentioned that Alex O'Connor's coming on the podcast, people go, "Oh, Cosmic Skeptic." And I don't know if that fills you with joy or annoys you a little bit, seeing as are you detaching yourself from that label?
Yeah, people come up to me in the street sometimes. Are you Cosmic Skeptic? I say no.
No, I'm not.
I don't know him.
Can you tell us who he is and why you are no longer him?
Who he was. I wish I could quote that scene from A New Hope, where old Ben Kenobi. That's a name I haven't gone by in many years. No, look, I mean, it's still my handle. I'm still like at Cosmic Skeptic on all social media platforms.
Nice.
It sort of, I made it when I was a teenager, and I was fed up of explaining that to people when they asked what my YouTube channel was. Because it occasionally happens. I'll be in a conversation with somebody. Oh, what's your channel called? And I'm sort of saying it through gritted teeth. And the thing is, like in the sort of brave new world, it's not actually that unusual to find these kinds of usernames. I mean, there are some great commentators who are making a pretty good name for themselves with essentially these kinds of pseudonyms. People like Destiny, for example, Stephen Bunnell, but it's known as Destiny online. A lot of my atheist YouTube colleagues, Genetically Modified Skeptic, Rationality Rules, they're still keeping those monikers, and I can understand that sort of works in the modern age, but I feel like rebranding was a sensible move.
Is it partly because you're moving away from that era of your life?
Well, Christians I speak to like to sort of import some optimism into
He saw you coming a mile away there, Justin.
into my sort of move away from the Cosmic Skeptic name. It wasn't a proactive choice to undo those implications. However, I will say that just I guess by coincidence or it wasn't like a conscious name change for that reason, but it is true that the whole sort of skeptical primacy of reason, rationality, question everything type stuff. I mean, my ancient website that I haven't changed in years, I think still has the tagline like "question everything," which is such a lazy such a lazy tagline. I mean, it's essentially a paradox as well. It's almost self-defeating. It's like this statement is false. It's like question everything except that you should question everything. I suppose maybe I did follow the question everything line so much that I started questioning whether we should question everything. And I began to realize that if there's something that philosophy is supposed to be for, it's not supposed to be for, as Lewis had it, cutting down forests, but for irrigating deserts. There's no point in just pulling apart a painting and trying to find out what it's made of and saying, oh, look, it was painted oil on canvas, and we know that because we've torn it apart and looked at it. Like the point is to just step back and look at the painting sometimes. And so philosophy, what's the purpose of it? Is it to like sort of tear things apart and analyze them bit by bit, or is it something else? I mean, since the ancients, people have thought that the real aim of philosophy is to live well, is to learn how to live well. And I feel like the primacy of skepticism can sometimes obstruct that. Skepticism is seen as an end in itself. You just cut things down for the sake of cutting them down, when you should be cutting things off in an attempt to chisel out of some marble a beautiful sculpture,
So when it comes to the evolution of your channel, your content, I first bumped into you in your teenage years, and we've got a funny story there of you responding to a video of mine, and then
Are you going to tell it?
Well, I had put out a kind of YouTube video defending something called the fine-tuning of the argument.
Yes.
Fine-tuning of the universe for life. I'm using a sort of analogy to rolling a dice 70 times and getting a 6 every time. And Alex, I don't know how old you would have been at the time.
Probably 17 or 18.
Yeah. Did a response to this.
Oh,
basically
okay.
saying, who is this idiot? With his dice analogy. No, with some good responses actually. But someone and several people said this video to me, and I thought, oh, who is this young upstart? And so invited him on my show to come and debate it, not with me, with someone else.
There's an entry into my diary that I used to keep, like a handwritten diary from like 2017 or something that sort of says, oh, I've been invited onto the radio to debate, this question, and I'm writing in my diary like, oh my goodness, like at the radio, like I'm so nervous. What if I mess up? I've never done anything like this before. This is
the
so
reality
crazy.
is, by that point, your channel was way bigger than probably most of the audience for that radio program.
It's hard to say, but even so, like it's I know people who have really big YouTube channels who would be completely out of place giving a public talk to 20 people. It's just like a different experience.
Yes.
And there's something about the traditionalism of the radio format. You're not in control. You feel, and also I didn't know you at the time. Like I had no idea. Like, I mean, like right now I feel quite confident. If I were to say something I regretted, I could say, can we just stop? Can I say that again? But you don't know going into these things, and it can be quite intimidating because you speak to a lot of people, but you're in your bedroom with a camera. But here we are with these big soft boxes and nice cinema cameras and it's
Don't give away the magic.
It's
well, going back to my original question though, which was when we first encountered each other, you were in that sort of quite kind of arguably tearing down the arguments for faith sort of. Now you still do a certain amount of sort of debunking kind of type of stuff, but it feels like your content has changed as well. You seem to be actually having a lot of conversations with people from all walks of life, different interests, artists, philosophers, whoever. So it feels like arguably you're a bit less interested in just talking about atheism, let's say. You want to kind of experience a broader kind of aspect of life in that way.
Yeah, I mean, there's only so many times and so many ways that you can say God probably maybe doesn't exist. It starts to get a bit boring. I'm not sure for the audience, maybe not, but certainly for me, where I'm happy to do debates and public talks and this kind of stuff, but making a video again, I'm not so sure. What I began to get interested in was more specific areas of like Christian theology. Right, so I became quite interested in the Bible, in biblical stories, and the historicity of the Bible. The thing is, that's less my area, or has been less my area. And so what I found is that if I wanted to make a video about whether the Gospels are historically reliable, I'm really interested in that topic, but I can't do it with the same gusto because I'm not so confident, because it's something I'm not as knowledgeable about. So maybe I ask a friend to help me. Maybe I bring on an expert and have a conversation with them. And I can't be combative because I haven't got the goods. And I have to just have a genuine conversation where I'm actually searching. And it's just so much more edifying and so much more enjoyable. And so then even with the stuff that I am much more opinionated about, I think that taking that style of conversation and applying it there
does
is
that work as well
equally helpful.
in the kind of clickbait world we live in, though? Because I think a lot of channels and media is built on people being very sure of their opinions and kind of saying it very demonstrably.
And it's worth doing it where it matters and where you can. I mean, I don't know. There are certain conversations and certain topics with certain people that you're inevitably going to just have an argument. And you do actually know what you're talking about, and you have every right to sort of, stick your flag in the ground and not so much die on a hill, but win on it. Fine, okay. I find that like people have sometimes commented that I change in my approach depending on what I'm doing. If you listen to one of my podcast episodes, it's very conversational. Like the objection comes, well, people might want to ask, you can imagine a world in which this is the case. What would you say if this objection were raised, right? I could have the same person in front of me, but I'm on someone else's show and it's styled as a debate, and it's no longer that. Now it's, hold on, haven't you considered this? What about this? No, think about this, And I guess I think that if I invite someone into my space, onto my show, they do it for free. They're doing me a favor. Yeah. And I just sit them down and completely grill them. If they're not expecting that, especially, I just think it's a bit unfair,
Yeah, no, it's charitable, I think, to kind of give someone the space to say what they think.
And we learn so much more because, like intuitively, you say, okay, if there's an area that I don't know very much about, if you had someone on to talk about, I don't know, something that I don't know what you don't know about. I don't know if you know anything about,
There's lots I don't know about.
Car mechanics. I mean, I don't, right? You think to yourself, okay, I'm not going to argue with this person. I'm going to ask them real questions. But you might think, well, if somebody comes on and they're talking about Christianity, oh, well, now I'm going to really I've got my position and I'm going to. But if you sort of act as if you don't know anything about Christianity, you might sort of surprise yourself by what you become convinced of, So I don't know, like if I'm talking to a Christian, and I'm in there with the goal of essentially debating them and posing objections. And when they're speaking, what am I doing? I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to say next. I'm trying to figure out what's my objection going to be. Where am I going to sort of shoehorn in the objection? Whereas if I'm just willing to let them speak and then go like, interesting, thanks, then I'm just listening, and I might actually learn something, which is a novelty perhaps in the modern online space.
That does seem to be something that sets your content apart, is you wanting to soak up as much knowledge about Christianity as possible. Am I right in thinking that you have a degree in theology?
Yeah, philosophy and theology.
Philosophy and theology.
Filthy for short.
I've never heard that before. Why? Why did you want to do that? I don't know a huge amount about your story. Were you a Christian at the time, or have you always been an atheist? And if why?
I was an atheist at the time of Blind. I already had my YouTube channel at the time of Blind. Probably the only reason they let me in, actually. I mean, seriously, I got 3 U's the first time I did my A-levels and overslept one of my exams. It was at 1 p.m. and I overslept it.
Wow, nice.
Still managed to claw it back. The sort of God's honest answer, as it were, is that I wanted to study philosophy, and I was applying to Oxford rather than Cambridge. You can only apply to one. Everyone says this, but I really didn't think they were going to let me in. I refer back here to the grades I just mentioned. But I was told that Oxford care less about grades and more about your personal statement. I don't know if that's true.
Okay, but it worked for you.
That's what I was told, right? And so I write this personal statement. I've got this YouTube channel. It's verified by Google, which means I had enough subscribers that they put a little tick on it. But you make it sound nice, And at Oxford, they don't let you do philosophy on its own. You can't do it.
Okay.
You have to pair it with something. So PPE is the famous one, philosophy, politics, and economics. You could do philosophy and French. You can do philosophy and maths. Philosophy and theology felt like the most natural fit because it seemed most relevant and I was talking about religion after all, as well as just philosophy. And so it was partly by necessity. My second choice was Edinburgh to do philosophy and politics, for example.
Okay.
Having said that, as soon as I started doing it, I realized that this is just wonderful. I was learning so much, and I was able to bring so much more to the table immediately when it came to making videos and having discussions with people. And so I'm really grateful that sort of necessity put me in that situation.
Was it strange? I mean, I'm fascinated by. Now you are Gen Z, right?
I never know what counts.
I think
I was
95?
born in 1999.
yeah, you're definitely Gen Z. Then.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Just about
So-
90s.
so-
You're comfortably. I'm on the brink, but you're comfortably in there.
So, the big difference between when I was at Oxford and your experience is probably that you arrived in the era of YouTube and kind of the ability for an 18-year-old at that point to already be quite well known potentially. So that must have changed the experience of kind of going in, because you were already in that sense of personality even at that point. You had an already quite successful YouTube channel and everything, dealing in the kinds of areas that you were going in to learn about, alongside. So what was that like? Does that change the experience, do you think, of doing a degree?
Maybe. I mean, I think at the time I must have had some 150,000 subscribers or something, which
Is that all?
well, it's a lot. It's like how wonderful, how it's difficult to explain how much luck there is involved, and how grateful I feel now, and probably should have felt at the time, and did to a degree, but I think more so now. But relative to now, it's smaller, but it's still like you say, you're in an area where that stuff's being discussed more often. But you find that, like, especially because you're like this arrogant, loudmouthed kid who's mouthing off about philosophy and theology. Yeah, people might have heard of the channel, but you're in an academic environment where they're probably looking at it and thinking, like, who's this guy? Like, a lot of my friends have admitted this to me, where, like, people I met who had seen the videos that I've made, and we ended up becoming friends and debating and talking about theology. They tell me that before they met me, they'd see my videos and think, oh my goodness, what is he talking about? And they were right to, because some of my older videos, they're nonsense, essentially, philosophically speaking. And so, like, I did have a slight feeling that, like, yeah, look, I've spent more time than the average 17, 18-year-old thinking about the Kalam cosmological argument and the problem of evil, right? And so going in to study theology, I did feel like I reckon I can do this quite well, and was just immediately floored by tutors and by friends. Most of the friends that I had who were postgraduate were religious, because I think that if you're studying theology and philosophy, there are atheists who do philosophy, of course, but if you're doing theology, for example, you're unlikely to get a PhD in the New Testament as an atheist. People do it. It's the kind of thing I might do because I'm interested, but you can see why the majority of people are slightly vocational.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to debate the historicity of the Gospels, for example, with someone with like an actual PhD in that subject. What am I doing? And maybe that's part of the reason why nowadays, when I get the great joy of being able to sit across from some kind of expert on my podcast, I sort of remember that scenario and think that I don't know what I'm talking about.
It inspires a bit of humility, I suppose.
Of course, yeah.
And I know that you made quite good friends, actually, with a lot of the Christians that you were alongside at a university. And again, that's what I appreciate about you, Alex, is there's both this sense that you're willing to kind of essentially change your mind on things and revisit some of those old arguments and early videos and so on, but also I've always felt like you in rather actually like one of your favorite atheists, Christopher Hitchens, you were open to actually developing relationships with people across the aisle, and that must have also impacted the way you then approached the subjects and so on.
But then also, like, I think people are often quite self-congratulatory about reaching across a non-existent aisle, in that, like, it's not some sort of chasm of separation between me, a sort of like a guy who's born in England a country with a relatively Christian heritage, with a certain moral worldview, which I don't think is Christian in the way that Tom Holland would say it's Christian. But you know what I mean? Like, to somebody else who's grown up in the same place, with the same media, with the same TV shows, the same music and all that kind of stuff, and just believes in the existence of God. Of course, we're going to disagree about philosophy, but it's not like we're not going to be able to get on.
Sure.
You know, like meeting someone from a different country. If I meet someone from halfway across the world with a different religion, a different cuisine, a different music, a different language, then it's going to be
harder.
Much more difficult, and it would really be an exercise in reaching across an aisle to certainly become like best friends with them. It would require a lot of sort of compromise in what you're used to talking about and how you're used to behaving and that kind of stuff. It didn't require that much.
Okay.
I just got on with these people because although we disagreed about God, we liked talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the friendship. That was the OU2 that C.S. Lewis says is the beginning of every friendship. Is you also like to sit for hours and talk about the modal ontological argument. You know, awesome. I couldn't care what your conclusion is on the matter. The fact that you're willing to talk to me about it for an hour, that's enough to keep us going. You know.
You, albeit like you say, in very different ways, using different methods. Sometimes you still are doing what you started back then. And I'm just quite fascinated because your audience is pretty massive, and it's not like you talk about light things and you put yourself in challenging situations, and you, in many ways you think on behalf of hundreds of thousands of people, and that's a lot. So I'm just, how is that?
Well, I hope I'm not thinking on their behalf. I mean, and if you read my comment section, you'll know that they do disagree with me every now and again, which is good. Which is good.
Yeah,
and
that's what you want. Question everything, you know.
Yeah. It is a bit weird to think that lots of people are listening, but that's actually why I like being a podcaster so much, because you know I went back and watched one of those old videos. I think it was my old video on the ontological argument from when I was a teenager, and it actually came up because some friends in a group chat had posted it to laugh about it because it was so terrible. And I was looking at the comments, and you know, someone says, "Oh, I've got my philosophy of religion exam coming up for like A levels, and this has been really helpful for studying." And I thought, this poor child has just failed his exam just because of me. No, I mean, I'm sure it was fine, you know, but I was thinking, oh dear, you know, that's quite concerning, especially if someone were to come up to me and say, "You're the reason I'm an atheist." I think, well, obviously, thank you for the implicit compliment that what I've said has convinced you in some way. But at the same time, that's quite a big thing, you know, like your worldview. And I know it's uncomfortable to feel in any way responsible. Have you never set out
to be, in that sense, an evangelist for atheism then?
No, well, I don't know. It's hard to sort of get into my own head from a few years ago. Like you don't remember what all of your hopes and motivations for the world are. But I don't know. I find it sort of. I've always said to people in this discussion that I would love to believe in God. I'd love to be a Christian. You know, I wish it were true. It would be awesome. And so if that's the case, then it's not. I don't feel like I can celebrate when someone, you know, the whole language of spiritual autonomy and throwing off this oppressive religious. Like some circumstances, yes, that's true. Some religious traditions, I think that's the case. But I'm not going to like celebrate someone becoming an atheist. Like whatever, you know, do your thing, believe it or don't believe. Like I'm not like trying to make the world into atheists. I'm not sure if that would be a good or a bad thing. I have no idea. I just don't think it's true. I'm interested in the truth question. But it does feel a little bit like, or when somebody does say something like that, "You're the reason I'm an atheist." At first, I'm suspicious that I'm really like surely if you take me out of the picture, surely it would have still happened at some point, you know. But it's still like, wow, you know, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Whereas with podcasting, it's like it's someone else. You know, you're just sort of bringing in someone else's wisdom. And if somebody comes on and convinces your audience to be an atheist, then next week you can bring on someone to convince them to be religious. You know, you can try to balance things out in a way that you can't do if you're just speaking your mind. So these days, I guess I'm doing less of what you were talking about, which is trying to say, here's me, here's my view, and here's why you should agree with what I'm saying. Rather, here's just an interesting thought to consider in the mouth of someone who knows what they're talking about, you know?
Yeah. And I suppose that helps as well because I don't know, most people get the luxury of having of working out what they think in private and then if they want to go public with it. But are you giving yourself more of that luxury now to kind of...
and I like to think that I always have, in that I'm not going to immediately share you know, thoughts that are starting to occur unless I share them or making that plain. So, I've been thinking about this. Like, you can watch the trajectory of my videos talking about ethical emotivism. And a few years ago, you would have heard me say, I think that I'm quite attracted to ethical emotivism, but I'm not sure. And then a year later, it's like, I'm basically an ethical emotivist. And nowadays, I'm like, yeah, I'm an ethical emotivist, right? And I've been talking about it all that time, but the confidence level has been increasing. You throw it out, you test the waters, and maybe you get some pushback, and you debate it. And it's only after that you can be a bit more confident about it.
I mean, another thing that you became known for, at least for a good while, was veganism and championing that as an ethical lifestyle. I'd just be fascinated for a kind of a brief understanding of what led you in that direction, how it kind of related potentially to the philosophy, theology, and so on that you were interested in, and why you changed your mind on that one.
Well, it was out of left field. It was totally, seemingly, at least, unrelated to God and philosophy and all of this kind of stuff. It's so random, which is why I think a lot of my audience would have been quite affronted when suddenly it basically becomes everything that I'm the only thing that I'm talking about. Because to this day, I'll still say that factory farming, at least, is this great unspoken moral emergency that no one talks about. I mean, I think to myself, if you were to go onto the street and ask people for their top 100 moral issues, I don't think that they would mention factory farming, maybe not even animal cruelty, in that top 100. And yet, since I started this sentence, we've killed millions of animals, billions if you're including fish. It's amazing to think about. And I suppose I was just sort of really confronted by this. I was arrested by it, as they say. And I thought, gosh, as many people do who have some kind of platform, when an important issue comes their way, they feel a duty to use it to do some good. And you shouldn't do it with everything. But I thought, well, this can be my thing because I feel passionate about it. No one else seems to really be doing it, except for people who have channels just dedicated to that. So I took it on, and it was. I haven't spoken a lot about what happened there outside of announcing it, and I just spoke on another podcast about this a little bit, and the reason is because although I wanted to let people know, I also didn't want people to think that I'm suddenly anti-vegan, right? Like if you make a video or an explanation, or even right now if I'm talking to you and I say, well, these are the reasons why I changed my mind and I no longer believe in this, it can come across as, or it necessarily comes across as me giving you reasons not to do it, which is something that I really didn't want to do, and still I think don't want to do, because I still think it's a noble pursuit. But then clearly, if I couldn't keep it up, it would be wrong of me to continue to promote it, So the fact that I was experiencing practical difficulties, there were philosophical shifts. Right. There are changes in the way that I view this issue that have occurred. The problem is that because they coincided with the practical difficulties, I'm very suspicious of my own reasoning there. Right? Like what a coincidence that around about the time that you start experiencing practical difficulties, suddenly you have this philosophical change. So I think it would be potentially misleading of me to give those philosophical reasons as if that was really what was going on. I think it was a practical thing, if you see what I'm saying.
I totally get that. And to some extent, to bring it back to the God thing, I think we're all a mixture of motives.
It would be like the Ayaan Hirsi Ali thing, right? Where if Ayaan Hirsi Ali had actually added like this appendix to her essay that included like an argument for God's existence that she'd become convinced of. She just wrote about the Kalam cosmological argument. You think, well, great, she's tackling the argument, but maybe a little bit sort of convenient that around about the time that you start worrying about Russia and woke culture and all this kind of stuff, suddenly the Kalam cosmological argument sounds to you. It seems like maybe there's some motivated reasoning, because like you say, we're emotive creatures, and I feel like maybe something like that might have been going on.
Well, it's interesting you bring up.
This is weird. I'm just going to sit back because I feel like you two are like opposing forces, and I'm just going to enjoy this. On you go.
No, but we are slightly in Geeksville, I will admit.
I'm loving it. Carry on. I feel like a listener.
The world of Christian apologetics and atheist apologetics. No, but I think you're absolutely right. I wouldn't disagree that there's lots of motives that go in. And is it Jonathan Haidt who's talked about the idea of the elephant and the rider, and the fact that we tend to think that, we like to think at least, that we're purely guided by our and so on. But in fact, what's often happening in the way that a rider sits on top of an elephant and assumes that they're guiding the elephant, in fact, it's the elephant doing the guiding. And what we're the rider in this analogy is our intellect, our reasoning ability, but really the thing that we're using that to justify is really our gut sense of what right and wrong is, what, you know, and that, a lot of that comes from all kinds of other things than just pure reason. So there's this sense in which inevitably, whether we call ourselves Christian atheist or something else, we're using our intelligence, our reason, to justify the things we already believe deep down, basically.
I think that's something that I've been trying to make noise about recently. I like when, if you ask what I guess is the hill that I'm dying on at the moment, it's about the emotive quality of human behaviors, how much we are motivated unknowingly by essentially emotive forces and dressing it up in the language of reason. I just had Robert Sapolsky on the show, who is a philosopher, I think, at Stanford, and he's written a book about free will. And he told me about this great study that you might have come across, where they were trying to find out what was the biggest predictive factor as to whether a judge, I think, would grant bail or not. Based on some kind of crime they would have given these judges, and they're given the opportunity to grant bail or to send them back to prison. And they were trying to figure out what's the biggest predictive factor. If you take a judge and you sort of take away like political bias and stuff, what's the biggest predictive factor as to whether they'd send them back to prison or not? You know what they found it was? How long it had been since the judge had last eaten a meal.
Wow.
That was it. And
Gosh.
people get sent to prison or not, based on how long it's been.
How hungry the judge feels.
Since someone's eaten. And people know this on a less serious level. Everyone is familiar with the sort of, oh, sorry, I was a bit hangry, or maybe I should sleep on it. Why do we sleep on it? What does that mean when you got a decision to make? Sleep on it, because you recognize that obviously, if you're tired, if you're hungry, if you're stressed, you're not in a position to think rationally. Well, I think that when you wake up in the morning, you're certainly in a position to think more rationally, but you are still being dictated to by your emotions in exactly the same way you were the night before, just perhaps to a less extreme degree, or to a less unusual degree, or sort of, this is more like what you would usually do, but it's still just emotions all the way down, if you ask me.
If you enjoy listening to Re-Enchanting, then you'll probably enjoy our other two podcasts from Seen and Unseen. Seen and Unseen Aloud is a weekly dose of commentary on culture, trends, and current affairs. God Pod is a deeper dive into theology and faith, hosted by Graham Tomlin, Jane Williams, and Michael Lloyd. You can find them wherever you get your podcasts from. For now, back to today's episode of Re-Enchanting.
So how does that lens that you're really immersed in at the moment, put that on the God desire? How does that affect the way you see belief or non-belief in God?
Well, it makes me, I don't know, it makes me think that it would be easy to try to translate that into terms of just like, oh, well, then maybe someone's an atheist because they want to be an atheist, because they want to sin, or someone believes in God because they just want there to be an afterlife. I don't think it's a surface level as that. I don't think that the emotions work on that level. I think they're much deeper. So,
okay.
And I really mean like the stuff that we really think is rational, like the laws of logic, the law of non-contradiction. Why can't P be true and false at the same time? It just can't. It just can't. Your brain just says no. There's no reason, there's no rationality, it just feels wrong. It's what a philosopher might call an intuition, which is just another word for feeling. And think how often philosophers rely on intuition. This happens all the time. Think about ethics, right? Like if you're discussing something with a utilitarian, and let's take a really crude utilitarianism.
Are you about to give us a trolley problem at this point?
No, but like think about, okay, so imagine the trolley problem, but not even a trolley problem. Just imagine you just promoting utilitarianism, and you say, I think we should maximize pleasure for the greatest number. And someone comes along and says, but don't you know that if we did that, that would lead to this, evil conclusion. That would lead to us having to kill 5 people to save 1. And that works as an objection. Like, why?
Yeah.
Like, hold on a second. What do you mean? Like, who cares? Like, the whole point is that we've come up with an ethical theory to tell us what's right and wrong. And the only way, not just one of the most popular ways, the only way that people debate and discuss ethical theories and test them is they test them against what? our intuitions, which is just the way we feel. So what we do is we say we've got this ethical theory and we're trying to rationalize, we're trying to construct essentially like a sort of calculator. But when the calculator, gives us an answer that we feel is wrong, that we don't like, we don't accept the answer, we change the calculator. And so feelings are so dominant here. I mean, and you notice it all the time. Someone says, well, divine command theory can't be true because that would mean that if God commanded you to kill an innocent child, you should do it. And the answer should be, well, so what? Why does that function as an objection? Well, because that just feels, and because saying it feels wrong just immediately exposes that we're just allowing our emotions to dictate what we're thinking. Oh, we invent this new word. Oh, it's intuitively wrong. Listen to your intuition.
But it's just another way of saying your feelings.
Yeah. But I think the same thing goes on outside of the ethical context, is what I mean.
Yeah. I guess then the question is, can we ever escape, effectively us all just doing things because of the way we feel, essentially?
No. We can't because we can't even talk about it sufficiently because we're constrained by our language just as we're constrained by our own brains. It's kind of like how you'll never actually interact with the real world except through the biases of your sense perceptions. If you didn't have ears and a nose, but you did have eyes, but the eyes only saw infrared, you would experience the world in a completely different way. And yet it would all be just as real. The infrared beams are still going into your eye. They're still actually there, but you would have a different picture of what the world is. You'd have a different perception of what it means for something to be physical matter. All of this would just sort of fly out of the window. And it's all just determined on the contingencies of how our senses have evolved. And I think the same thing happens with our language when we're talking about philosophy, when we say something is true or false, or when we're talking about when we talk in terms of syllogisms or all of this kind of stuff. It's like it's necessarily not going to be able to capture what I think is the truly emotive foundation of all of our philosophizing, because we just don't really have the language to talk about it.
I obviously the work of Tom Holland, the work of Glenn Scrivener, there's probably tons of others, would say that these intuitions are not, well, that they're contingent upon Christianity. You hinted earlier that you don't believe that. You don't think that's quite the case. So this intuition that if you to kill a child would be wrong, I think Tom Holland would say, at least to a degree, that wasn't always the case. In ages gone by, that wouldn't feel as wrong as it does now. There's a reason it feels wrong. It's not innate. It's something we've been taught, and we've been taught it by this odd little Jesus story.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
I think it doesn't come from the story. I don't think it comes from the scripture. And again, this isn't really my area. That's why I'd love to speak to Tom Holland on the podcast, because I wouldn't want to debate him. I'd want to ask these questions. The biggest question I have is like, what are we talking about here when we say Judeo-Christian culture, Judeo-Christian society? Because if you removed those words and just made the same argument, your intuitions that you have ethically right now, they're really based upon, and you can't say Christian society. What do you say? Maybe the history of Europe in the past few hundred years, because you can't be talking about the scripture, and you can't be talking about the Bible. You can't be talking about that. Surely not. I mean, what are the kind of things that we talk about? We talk about the abolitionist movement in Europe, and we talk about the you just talked about killing children. I mean, I just had an hour-long conversation with William Lane Craig, where it got almost memed on the internet, because he sat there sort of smiling, perfectly nice, as Craig is, with this sort of yellow jumper on, explaining to me why it was perfectly morally justifiable for the Israelites to slaughter the Canaanites, including the children, because, well, if they're innocent children, then they get to go straight to heaven. So if anything, they're actually doing him a favor. Right. And Craig says, I thought long and hard about who's being wronged when the Israelites slaughtering the innocent children. He stipulates that they are innocent children. So I thought, well, who's being wronged there? And he realized the people being wronged, really, if anyone, are the Israelite soldiers. Because can you imagine how difficult it would be to have to break into someone's house and murder an innocent mother and child? Now, to me, that is what you have to say if you believe in the story of the Old Testament. And so when someone says to me, well, the reason why your intuition about killing children, the reason that you have that is because of Christianity, I say, maybe it's something to do with Jesus. Maybe we can talk about the New Testament as a separate entity. I think it's just got more to do with sort of the development of popular ethics in European society. I don't think I can say it's Judeo-Christian, because if I look at the scripture, it's the first place I can turn to completely negate that intuition.
Yeah.
But in a sense, whatever the thing is that's created in you, that sense that we should at some level value life, in a sense, you're not going to reach for a kind of objective rational argument. You're going to always say it's because I feel like it, right? It's not something that you can sort of and to that extent, we've debated this before on your podcast a few years ago, Alex, but you're not someone who believes there's a kind of an objective ethical realm out there, if you like. There's no kind of law that exists outside of our own preferences and things to say we should treat people this way, we shouldn't treat them that way.
Yeah, well, the preferences are kind of are the law, because that's sort of just what your brain does. And of course, there are people who might just not feel that way, and there's nothing an emotivist can say to that. That is moral nihilism. I'm afraid it is. It puts the nihilism in moral nihilism to say that. It's not a happy philosophy. Like I'm not glad of that. I just think I just see abounding evidence that when people are emoting, when people are ethicizing, moralizing, they are just emoting. And there are examples that we could talk about that I think are like really, really bring that home. But they're a little bit sort of, weird and a bit funny to talk about, because it's like more you have to talk about immoral things or things that people don't like talking about. But I think there are lots of specific examples I can point to where the only explanation for why something is considered immoral is just emotions. But, beside that, okay, I don't believe in like an objective moral realm. Like, no, but I don't even really know what that means. Like, I don't know what it is that you're talking about.
I guess I would reach for the word intuition, and maybe
then you're doing the same thing that I am, which is saying that it's feeling.
Well, yeah, I guess, but our intuitions are obviously to some extent shaped by our environment. So I would say I'm broadly sympathetic to Tom Holland's argument that the fact I believe in caring for the vulnerable, human rights, equality, dignity, I think you can trace those back to a sort of the Christian story, kind of certainly propagating that and bringing it into, and to that extent, but even though I'm fully aware that I'm a product of my environment and my feelings about that are inevitably tied to the culture I've inherited, I still can't get away from the idea that I think that's true. I think that's really, we've discovered something true about reality, not just what I happen to prefer in this moment. And I think most people who have those beliefs feel like this is true. Like racism is wrong. And at times in the past where people didn't believe that, they were wrong about that. They were just factually incorrect. Whereas I think what you're saying is, at this moment in time, you feel like racism is wrong. But the people who didn't in the past, that was just the way they encountered life and their feelings about the matter. And there's no right or wrong, it's just feelings.
Yeah, well, there are a few things to say. The first is that although I do think it is all emotions, there are ways that emotions can accurately and inaccurately map onto reality. And an example I often give is that of Pavlov's dogs salivating at the sound of a bell. When the food is presented to them and the dogs start salivating, that seems more, I don't want to say sort of true, but it seems more appropriate, let's say, than when they start salivating at the sound of the bell and there's no real food. Now, the act of salivating can't be true or false. It's just sort of something that the dogs just do, right? But there's a sense in which, in one instance of salivating, it actually maps onto the world in a real way, and in the other sense, it doesn't. There's like a mistake going on. Even though there's no truth or falsity, there's a mistake being made, right? And so I think that something similar can happen with emotions, where like you can, I don't know, if you are someone who otherwise cares very deeply about your mother, and then your mother dies in a car crash and you just don't care, or you're happy about it, like the emotivist can't say that someone who's happy that their mother has died is doing something wrong. That like in all cases where that's true, that there's something wrong with their brain. But if you know that this person is the kind of person who does actually care about their mother, who does have that sort of emotional tendency, then when they're really happy about the news, you can assume that something's gone wrong. They've misunderstood something. Like something is not mapping onto reality in the right way, even though it's just an emotion. And happiness can't be true or false. And so that's one thing to say, is that like I think that people can sort of have broad emotive approaches to the way ethics should be done, but in the specificities,
I get what you're saying,
essentially contradict themselves.
I mean, forgive me if I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, but that if the way you react doesn't kind of lend itself towards living a life that is kind of flourishing and if you act essentially psychopathically almost in the world, then yes, it's going to have bad outcomes.
Something like that. Like for example, tribes that would sacrifice children because they sort of believed that they were sacrificing it to a god that was keeping them safe or something. Like, I don't know. I could sort of still put in emotive terms that maybe they were morally doing it. Maybe it's not a descriptive, we're doing this to appease the gods, but we just think it's the right thing to do. I could say that even though that's just essentially, for an emotivist, like an emotive expression, I'm sure that there's something like not lining up with your general emotive feeling towards the safety and prosperity of your tribe and this particular action. It's not to say I can say that it's wrong or false or anything like that, but I do think that maybe their own sort of emotive expression is not mapping onto reality in the way that they think it is, without having to import truth and falsity to moral terms, without having to talk about the objective moral realm. But the other thing that I was going to say is, because it's important, and that's not me, I'd love to hear what you think of that, fine, but before we forget, because we were talking, you were talking about like the Christian story, the Tom Holland thing, and but what is it you said?
I said I'm a product, I acknowledge, of my circumstances.
Oh, yeah.
Inheriting that story.
Yeah, I suppose.
But I still feel like it's true.
The one thing that could be said is that if my picture of the world is right and that it is all just emotive, then it still could be the case that when we land on something like, let's treat individuals with compassion, we get that feeling that this is true. We start trying it out and we go, gosh, you know what, this feels right? That's my picture of the world. It's perfectly possible that of all the ancient philosophies that were giving different advice on how to live, the one that decided to sort of land on that intuitive feeling is the one that people sort of go, they listen to this Jesus fella and they go, you know what, like what he's saying makes sense. It doesn't necessarily mean that like you believe that because Jesus said so. It might mean that like somewhere lurking in there was this intuitive sense that actually compassion for the downtrodden is a good thing. And it just took someone to sort of bring that out and demonstrate it before people were like, sure. So in that sense, maybe, Christianity could have helped to bring out that intuition and let people know that that's what they sort of, the approach to ethics that makes most natural sense, fine. But then it's worth also pointing out that like, if you go, I mean, you said, I can't remember exactly what you said, but you said something like, oh yes, you were talking about racism. That's it. Like you say like, I have this feeling that racism is wrong and that people in the past who thought it was okay were actually wrong. I'm like, does that include the God of the Hebrew Bible, who treats the Israelites explicitly differently from the nations around them, including saying that you can buy slaves from the nations around you and bequeath them to your children as inherited property, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. This seems to me like a sort of racial-based slavery that if we stripped it of its biblical context, if I went into Parliament over there and I delivered from the dispatch box, we should be able to take your male and female slaves should come from the nations around you. From them, you may buy and sell slaves. We should be able to take, even if they're temporary residents are living among us, we should be able to take them and bequeath them to our children as inherited property, but you mustn't rule over your fellow Brits ruthlessly. No. I think it would be a moral obscenity.
Well, I guess...
And so if anything...
I fear this is turning into the Alex and Justin debate show.
I'm thoroughly enjoying the Alex and Justin
I think
show.
if the New Testament has installed a sense of sort of caring for the victim and universality of ethics and this kind of stuff, if anything, we should be grateful that that's a great correction of what the Old Testament had done.
The thing for me is that I totally understand, and I've hardly been able to bring myself to listen to that interaction you had with William Lane Craig on this, because I approach things very differently. But I just think that there's a difference between being able to say there's something objectively morally true about the statement racism is wrong, compared to, yes, of course, you can dig up all kinds of examples from the Old Testament. But the problem there is, I think, firstly, you don't have to believe in the truth of the Bible to believe in objective morality. So I think there's a slight switch and bait there. I think that it's also just a fact that, yes, the Bible is a very complex, nuanced book that you have to understand in its context and in its time. And a surface reading of the Old Testament, you could easily pull out lots of things that appear to be racist and unjust in the way that God deals with the Israelites. My feeling is, once you dig into that, there's something else going on, which is about a revelation that's going on through the whole of Scripture that culminates in Jesus. So I'm a bit
I can accept
wary
that.
of
And
people who just
it's also
pluck out something
clear-
from Deuteronomy and say, "Isn't this awful?"
That's fair enough, because I agree that we shouldn't just pluck things out. I do think that in particular those verses pertaining to slavery in the Old Testament are not. I mean, I don't think they're just taken out of context, but that's a conversation for another time. But I will say that it's clear to me that like Jesus and the story of the Good Samaritan, the message of that is clear, is obvious.
Yeah.
Like clearly that is sort of pointing to what you're talking about.
I guess my overall point is simply that if, on the balance of the whole thing, I want to live in a world, and this is a preference, this is my emotion, I suppose, speaking. I want to live in a world where it's true that racism is wrong. That's not just kind of the socio-evolutionary hand we happen to have been dealt at this moment that makes me feel that. And I don't know whether you have any inclination to wish that it really is true objectively, these things, or whether you're just perfectly happy with it just being kind of the way we feel in that sense.
Well, because I translate as an emotivist, emotivism is really a theory of language rather than a theory of ethics. It means that I translate moral terms like right and wrong into emotive expressions. So just to say I want something to be right and wrong, well, I think it is right and wrong. I just mean something different by the words right and wrong there. Am I like happy that this is the way I think the world works? Like, not really. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm like proactively unhappy about it, but like I don't lose sleep over it or anything. It'd be nice to think that there were some objective list of ethical commands that we knew were the right thing to do and we could follow them like that. That would be great. But there are, I think that the fact that that's such an attractive proposition should give us pause for thought when we claim to intuitively think it's true. Because the more attractive a philosophy, the more resistance I think we should put up. That's not to say it can't be true, but I think we should put up more resistance to accepting it, because you've got that extra sort of bit of gravy, like to attract you to swallow that pill. I think my issue with the culmination in Jesus, long story type stuff, I think, like, I can't say that's wrong. What I can say, however, is that if contingently European society had evolved differently and we actually doubled down on slavery, and we currently lived in a society where people were enslaved, where women were treated terribly, all of that, where homosexuals were not tolerated or perhaps even killed, we could just as easily say, I could write a book called Dominion that says that all of the values that we have today, you don't realize it, but they're actually essentially biblical. Read all of these great stories of the Old Testament. Read the great sort of books of law, and you'll find that you probably would like. Why did God?
Like you do need the debate with Tom Holland.
Why did God have to say to the Israelites, if you lie with another man, then you should be stoned? Didn't they already know that? No, they didn't even know that homosexuality was wrong. It required the Hebrew God to come down and tell them that homosexuality is wrong. Therefore, if it weren't for that biblical story, then today we wouldn't think that homosexuality is wrong. We might have homosexuals living freely among us. Can you imagine such a thing? And if we lived in a society where most people thought that homosexuality was wrong, they'd go, oh gosh, how lucky we are to live in a society so influenced by biblical values. But when the exact opposite obtains, LGBT movement, women's rights, abolitionism, then you can say, but don't you know that the only reason that you think this is because of the New Testament? And so, sure, you can do that, but I think that's a demonstration of exactly what I think religion allows people to do, which is to take whatever they intuitively feel, whatever they just contingently have evolved to think is right and wrong, and refer to their religious tradition to justify it. I'm afraid that's a bit pessimistic.
Well, no,
and not very enchanting.
We're here to hear.
If anything, it's quite disenchanting.
The raw reality, according to.
But there it is. The whatever the opposite of God. What's the Greek for the bad news?
According the opposite of euangelion.
I don't know. I don't know what that would be.
We need a Greek.
The anti-gospel.
That's quite a title you're putting on yourself. Is that your next handle?
could be a good book.
Yeah, the anti-gospel. So does that annoy you? Does it annoy you then that what we seem to be seeing is a rise in people who are, you could make all kinds of arguments, but are looking at our cultural moment and are thinking, hang on, we're losing things, and then are saying, I tell you what we're losing. I tell you what umbrella we can put on everything we're losing. Christianity, quick, get it back, even if we don't believe in it.
No, I understand that. It doesn't annoy me at all. I completely understand it, partly because when I said a moment ago that Tom Holland can't be talking about the scripture, he must be talking about something else when he says that. But I understand what he means when he says like Christian society, right? And maybe it does just mean something like European history. But if that's sort of what we're talking about with Christianity, then yeah, I totally understand why people say we should cling on to that. Like, you know, a lot of the beautiful buildings that we have are...
Like the ones we're looking at now.
Yeah, I'm not sure about Parliament. Hard to know what influence religion had there, but certainly St. Paul's, just sort of down the river, a beautiful building that maybe we would have a similarly beautiful building in its place without religion. Probably not. But then I do think to myself, well, what would Jesus think about the construction of a great cathedral, the use of these funds into building this? Hard to say. I mean, he seemed okay with the Jewish temple. Like, I don't know, but it seems feasible to me that if we had a bunch of money that we could either use for some, you know, homelessness program, or we could build a cathedral, Jesus would probably be on board with giving it to the homeless.
I don't know.
Not sure. You know, the poor will always be with you.
You've got the story of where a woman pours out her expensive perfume, and it's Judas who says, "Oh, we should have given it to the poor."
That's true.
So for me, I don't think Jesus is anti-beauty in that sense. I think there are things that might seem, you know, a waste in economical terms,
No,
like
I
building a
agree with
massive
you.
cathedral.
But that's probably what that story is.
I don't know. There might be something.
But the reason I bring it up is to try and answer your question. That let's suppose it were the case that actually in that story Jesus did say, "Oh, actually you're right. You know, put away the perfume. Let's give it to the poor." If we knew that that's what Jesus said, and yet for some reason Christian society evolved to build these beautiful cathedrals, right?
Yeah.
Like when we talk about the loss of Christianity, we might mean the loss of. I mean, some Christians might talk about modern Christianity as having lost Christianity. Right? We're either talking about Christianity according to Jesus, or we're talking about Christianity as a social phenomenon.
Yeah.
The social phenomenon bit, when people say, I think it's a shame that we've lost it, and part of the architectural ugliness, I mean, you know, there's a reason the cameras are pointing in this direction and not that direction, because...
There is a big reason.
For the benefit of those who are listening and can't see what Alex is referring to, we have the backdrop of the beautiful backdrop of the Houses of Parliament is what we... on the other side of the building, it's more kind of...
It's grey.
It's a bit more grey and not very interesting, and hence why we film in this.
Sorry to anyone who lives in
I
South
understand,
London.
I understand why people might look at that and say, if everyone were a bit more religious and put sort of a sense of worship into everything they did, then buildings might be more beautiful. I'm not sure if that's true. I don't know. But if it were, I understand why people would lament the loss of Christianity, even if they don't think it's true. So yeah, like I understand and don't necessarily dispute the sadness, the lamentation of the decline of the social sort of the social product that is Christianity. But I'm not sure how much of whatever sort of societal decay you might observe is actually down to that. And also, I don't think it's relevant to the truth value of Christianity.
I agree.
The thesis of my book, as you know, Alex, is that actually I don't think we've produced these wonderful things that we do value on the basis of they're just being useful. I think it's if there's any use to them, it's because it came from something true, you know, the Christian story. And so when I am interacting with some of these folk who are kind of talking about the value of Christianity, I want to kind of push them further and say, it's not good enough just to say it's really useful. It was only ever useful. It only produced something useful because I think it was true to start with. I suppose this is leading to a question, really a personal question for you, which is you kindly came along to an event which Belle was also at, where I sat down with Tom Holland to talk about his whole thesis, but also he shared some quite personal details. He was quite candid about his own spiritual journey, the way in which he was very affected by going to northern Iraq and kind of an experience in a desecrated church bombed out by ISIS, and sort of sensing, as he called it, a sort of thin place between heaven and earth. And then something he hadn't really talked about publicly before, but has now, which was a cancer diagnosis he experienced, and a kind of prayer of desperation on after a midnight mass service, where he kind of prayed about it, and within a few weeks, the diagnosis was reversed, a set of unusual circumstances, and it's just led him to the point where he thinks, well, maybe in a bizarre twist, this could be true. the kind of extra interesting icing on the cake is that this prayer was actually directed at the Virgin Mary, because this happened in St. Bartholomew the Great, purportedly, the place where the Virgin Mary appeared about 800 years ago to the monks. And he openly sort of laughed about this and said, if there's a God, he certainly has a sense of humour, kind of to use this method to potentially bring me to the point of belief. Anyway, that's Tom Holland's journey.
Well, you'll remember I texted you.
Yeah, what do you think about?
You asked me what I thought of the event.
Yes.
And you may remember what I texted you. It reminds me of when someone tried to assassinate Pope John Paul II, and the bullet travels through him and narrowly misses his vital organs. And the Pope, for some reason, decided that it was specifically the intervention of Our Lady of Fatima who had guided the bullet to miss his heart. One would have thought Our Lady of Fatima could have guided the bullet to miss him entirely, if you see what I'm saying.
I do see what you're saying.
To say, I've been diagnosed with cancer and now it's been reversed, and what a great miracle. I don't want to step on an experience like that, but I think that in the context of talking about the potential truth of Christianity on account of that, I think it misses the fact that the cancer was present in the first place, and it also neglects to consider perhaps the number of people who've prayed doubly desperately, not just for themselves, but perhaps for their children in a similar experience, and those prayers did not get an answer.
I think Tom would probably agree with you on all of that, and I don't think he's putting this argument out there to convince other people.
I agree, which is also why I don't want to sound like I'm just like stepping on his experience, right?
I think he's saying, but for me, in my very particular circumstances, and I think in the end, going back to your whole thing about emotivism and feeling, I feel like for whatever reason, a logical argument isn't necessarily going to be the thing ultimately that draws someone like Tom or whoever to. It's always going to be about something hits you.
Sure.
In the way that makes sense for you. And it might be absolutely not make sense for Alex O'Connor.
I agree.
So I guess my final question is, can you imagine what that would be for you, Alex, if it were to ever happen?
Well, it would probably be some kind of inexplicable experience that felt a little bit eerie, that felt sort of a bit too uncanny to just be put down to chance, that if I told anybody else, they would say well, that's a bit weird, but, probably they sort of look at me with a bit of suspicion, but if it was enough to convince me, it would be enough to convince me. I mean, I certainly don't think I'm going to, discover God at the bottom of a microscope or the end of a syllogism. And I don't think I'm supposed to either. I say it all the time that the Bible does not contain any syllogisms, not one, anywhere. Clearly, if there's a way that this is supposed to be done, it can't be that. It's got to be that. That's why I think the conversation has shifted. New atheism is characterized by by the primacy of rationalism and skepticism, whereas now the reason why new atheism has grown old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again is
to quote the subtitle of a book,
is probably partly due to the fact that the conversation has shifted from one of is the Kalam argument sound, to questions of beauty, questions of architecture. It's about the social stuff, the beauty stuff that we were just talking about. That's what people care about now. I mean, we haven't talked about arguments of God's existence, but this whole conversation, we've been talking about culture and beauty. And when I look at a building and think, well, why is it beautiful? Maybe it's beautiful because people were inspired to look upwards. Maybe the reason why Parliament is in this vertical Gothic style, it looks like it's made out of matchsticks, is because the idea was there was sort of a subconscious looking upwards, and maybe that's why it's so beautiful. Maybe the reason why the world is so ugly in the 20th century is because of the loss of Christian influence. Maybe though, the reason that the world's ugly in the 20th century is because of the World War. Maybe it's because of World War II. Maybe it's got something to do with the fact that London is bombed to oblivion and we had to rebuild quickly and cheaply. Maybe that's got something to do with the fact that we're not building St. Paul's Cathedral and the Palace of Westminster all over South London. Maybe it's got something to do with the fact that London is a growing city, more and more people coming into the city and indeed into the country, and so we can't keep up with the amount of people, so we have to build quickly and cheaply. And of course they're going to look ugly if you're building them quickly and cheaply. And maybe that's got something to do with the Christian ethos of opening up our doors in society and allowing people to come in. Maybe the horrible, ugly buildings that we're looking upon are a result of Christian society opening its arms, allowing so many people in that we have to build quickly and cheaply. So I get it, but I don't think we can say confidently enough in the way that people like to at the moment that, the reason the world is ugly is because of the loss of Christianity. And the reason the world used to be beautiful is because of the influence of Christianity. I mean, the world's always been ugly. If you just look away, if you take any beautiful picture, a historical painting of an old building, if you were able to step into the painting and turn around, you would just see, destitution behind you. That's always been the case. So in other words, I remain agnostic on this question, and so maybe I will look at St. Paul's for the 55th time and suddenly go, gosh, there is something about this grandeur and majesty that I can't quite put into words that maybe starts to point me to God. But then I think I'll just turn around and see the homeless man sleeping on the street outside of it, being trodden on by the thousands of people who walk past him every day, and be snapped out of it relatively quickly.
That's probably a suitably nihilistic point to end the show on. No, in all seriousness, it's been really fascinating, Alex, spending an hour or so with you. So much more we could have chatted about, but
and hopefully will at some point.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm just looking at our sheet, and we didn't get through half of our questions, which I think is the sign of a really great conversation.
Absolutely, yeah.
And also means that there's probably a part 2 in us.
Yeah,
I hope so. Well, my goal with any interview, whenever I do a podcast, I have a sheet of questions, and the goal is you ask the first one, and then you scrunch it up and throw it away. It's sort of an emergency sheet.
That's great. Great philosophy. Thanks for being our guest on Re-Enchanting. If you want more from Alex, we'll make sure there are links with today's show. You can find all his content, his own great podcasts and video channel, etc. But for now, thank you for being with us. If you want more content from Re-Enchanting, check out the podcast, the video channel, do like, rate and review.
Yeah, and you can head to seenandunseen.com for tons of articles about this podcast and all of the topics raised, and also seenandunseen.com/give if you want to support Re-Enchanting.
Absolutely. But for now, thank you for being with us. Thanks to Alex for being our guest, and we'll see you next time.